Thank you for the interview. You wrote both fiction and non-fiction. What is the importance of storytelling for an historian?
Well, it's very interesting. There is a completely different tradition in Britain than there is in the rest of Europe. Even the academic historians, the universities, follow the narrative tradition, which goes back to Gibbon in the 18th century, decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And that has always influenced the way that history is written in Britain. And it also emphasizes the fact that actually history is a part of literature. It is not a part of science. I mean, in Germany, there is this idea that, it's a scientific subject, but history can never be tested in a laboratory. So from that point of view, I think that the English approach is a little bit more wise because it doesn't presume to be scientific.
Thank you very much. I understand that one of the things that make your accounts very real is the fact that you deal with the horror of wars. But in an interview, I read that you avoid too graphic accounts. Correct me if I'm wrong. Can you explain your process of researching and selecting what to include in your books?
No, the only things that I have excluded are things which, shall we say, have either been so horrific. I mean, there is a degree of horror that one can inflict either on yourself as a researcher or on your reader. In fact, actually, Neil Ferguson accused me of writing the pornography of war, which I think is a bit unfair, especially coming from him. But anyway, there we go. But I think there are certain elements which are so appalling. I mean, for example, when I was dealing with the mass rapes of German women and of other countries, you had to be very, very careful that it does not become a form of war pornography. Yeah. And that's really the sort of, I think, the only limit that I would put in that particular way. But the vital thing, of course, is to show how it was the ordinary soldier, the women and the children who were the victims, crushed between two totalitarian systems. And one can only understand, really, the effects of, say, Stalin and Hitler on the lives of all of these people, in fact, if you integrate history from above with history from below. That, I think, is the only way to provide both the context and the detail.
And how can you avoid being overwhelmed by all of this horror that you deal with in your research?
Well, I had a bit of a nervous breakdown at the end of the Berlin book, which was the worst of the lot in many ways. I think the greatest was the cruelty to women and above all to children, which one came across, and very much in the Russian archives. I mean, there is the detail. Of course, the Russians are still very angry about the book, even though the material came from their own archives. Perhaps that was why.
Yeah. And dealing with today's meeting that we'll held today in Mantova, speaking of contemporary wars, what kind of source can you use for contemporary wars?
That is a very difficult subject. I mean, people have asked me, will I write a history of the Iraq War? I think it's becoming impossible for historians to be able to access material, because now, partly I hate to say it, but it's partly the fault of journalists wanting to write history on the hoof, and through the Freedom of Information Act and things like that, demanding access to secret papers, that as a result, ministers and generals are that much more nervous of any material which is controversial, and therefore they suppress it straight away. In the past, in the periods that I've been dealing with, all of the papers were boxed up and then they were sent off to the archives, but they were never destroyed. Yes. Now, what we are seeing, of course, is that it's so easy to eliminate emails, to reduce stuff. In fact, in cases of politicians, not to use their official email accounts, but to use private ones for controversial material. I think it's going to be very difficult for historians in the future.
And is there the process of fabricating sources? I was thinking to ISIS or Daesh that are creating videos.
Yes.
Are they usable for an historian, or as they are fabricated by the same social actor who you are studying, they cannot be used?
It's very, very hard. I mean, it's like any form of propaganda material. How much reliance do you put on it? Do you see the outtakes? I mean, in the Russian archives, for example, it's fascinating to see the film, and then you see the outtakes, and you see the same soldier who's just been shot in the film you've seen, getting up and doing it again, and then he's shot again and falls down, he's told to do it again. So you've got no idea what is true or what is false. And film, of course, is even easier to fabricate today. and as a result, it becomes very, very difficult to know what is true and what is created or what is invented.
Yes, and speaking of the power of words, there are several ways to deal with ISIS or Daesh. What kind of label would you use if you were dealing with them?
Well, it's very hard to use a correct label on, if you like, a self-appointed state, which is quite clearly not a state. It is a non-state player in the sort of terminology of international relations. But I think the important thing is not to try to define them too much. The great mistake, and this may sound ironic coming from me, the great danger is that the Second World War has become the defining reference point for every crisis and every conflict. And that means, though, that politicians, especially I'm afraid British and American ones, have tended to use the imagery and the verbiage of the Second World War. They like to sound Churchillian or Rooseveltian in their pronouncements because that makes them sound great and grand and important. But then if you start using, for example, comparisons, as George Bush did, between Pearl Harbor and 9/11, you're automatically turning what is a security problem into state-on-state warfare. And this is where this whole grey area between, if you like, terrorism and the conventional warfare of the past has become very, very complicated. And that's one of the things I'll be talking about this evening.
Thank you very much. Very last question. Beyond studying history, do you think that there's be some improvement in order to teach history, so to avoid committing always the same mistakes and having intellectual and political elite having a good knowledge of the past?
Well, I think it's terribly important to have a good knowledge of the past so that you do not recreate the same mistakes. The danger on one side is that people seem to, because they're so afraid of not understanding this new world we're in, because we are actually in a very new world in the terms of conflict, that people therefore try to look at history as a method to explain the future. Well, that's totally wrong. History can never be a predictive mechanism. But on the other hand, the real danger for most people is that their idea of history or their knowledge comes actually from fiction, from the invention of Hollywood, from television and so forth. And they've got really no idea of differentiating between fiction and fact. And that, I think, is actually becoming increasingly dangerous.
Thank you very much for the interview.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye.